Hello. Hi everyone. My name is Rożniecki and today I will talk to you about TIMTOWTDI and Java. But before, I must warn you, it will be not only about Java. First, few words about me. I've been a developer for 5 years. I started with Perl and JavaScript and later learned Java and use it right now in job. And also I like to describe myself as a software reader and writer because it's mainly what we do. We read code and write code. And basically, we read most of the time and write sometime. Yeah? And now you must wonder, and Perl and readable, it does not work, or does it? I will try to show you the concept of Perl, which learned me much, and I think you can learn from it too. So this talk is also available on GitHub. You can watch the slides right now or check the source code. So, TIMTOWTDI, what does it stand for? It's actually, there is more than one way to do it. And it's pronounced TIMTOWTDI, as you can hear. It's a concept from the Perl programming language, which was, as you can see here, I can show it to you, that it was from the beginning in the Perl Bible, which is Programming Perl, the book. It's also called the Camel book because it's a kind of a logo of Perl programming language, and it's very very important mantra of Perl, which is present in almost every aspect of that language. So, few words about the language from the creator, Larry Wall. The very fact it's possible to write messy programs in Perl is also what makes it possible to write programs that are cleaner in Perl than they could ever be in a language that attempts to enforce cleanliness. The potential for greater good goes right along with the potential for greater evil. So you might wonder, is it good or bad that I have a choice in the language? You might wonder, why should I do that? Because, for example, in Python, there should be one, and preferably only one obvious way to do it. And how does it relate to Java, for example, when the syntax is simple, it's not as complicated as in Perl, and you might wonder, why should I want TIMTOWTDI instead of this? Because sometimes you might want to have a flexible language, because you want to do the things that you 90% of the time you don't do, or 99, the number is irrelevant. You sometimes want to, for example, manipulate a simple table, and you want to do it, you want to be able to do it, yes? And for example, you want to have also power in the language to do things, the 1% of things which are hard, but they are possible. So, let me show you how TIMTOWTDI is present in practice, I mean in real life, for example in football, and let's take, for example, a goalkeeper. Goalkeeper, what's goalkeeper for? He is just a player who has probably the easiest task in the whole football team, because he just stands in the penalty box and saves some shots, and that's all. You might wonder, yeah, that's right. But take, for example, Michael Neuer. He is the goalkeeper for Germany team and previous World Cup, in which Germany won. And as you can see here, he is right there. There is a penalty box. There is somewhere here is goal line, and he is just saving the ball from the attacker. You know, the attacker here tries to shot on the target. And in this particular match versus Algeria, he did that many times. You might wonder, yeah, but it's an exception. I mean, how does it relate, for example, to an attacker who does the job in the opposite way? So, for example, let's take Fred, and he was the attacker in Brazil team versus Croatia. Actually, he had less touches outside of the box than Michael Neuer in this match in Algeria. So it wasn't actually an exception. It was a coach ordered him to act as a sweeper, as a last defender, because in this particular game, the coach knew that Algeria's attackers are not as strong as, for example, Brazil or Or even Poland in the last match, we have Robert Lewandowski and Michal Neuer didn't do that. But in this particular 1% of use case, he did more saves outside the box than Fred did. So back to programming languages. There is this famous quote by Bjorn Storstrup. He created C++. He said that there are only two kinds of languages. The ones people complain about and the ones nobody uses. So I have a pleasure to use Perl, JavaScript, and Java, and those are the languages people complain most about. I think I mean Perl, messy and something like that. JavaScript, also messy but very popular, and Java, verbose, enterprise, and all that. So, oh, by the way, the old joke about binary, and when you swap the 10, the 2 with 10, the number, which is 10, which is 2 in binary, of course, it's an old joke, but you get it, yes, but the guy here in the newspaper didn't, actually. So, back to the camel, because camel is, as I said, Perl symbol. How can you do a for loop in Perl? So it's quite obvious, yeah? It's only difference you can see is declaring of local variable by keyword my, and the sigil, the $sign here. But besides that, it's actually like in Java or C or any language, yes? But because Perl has TIMTOWTDI, it allows you to write this another way. For example, use the range operator, 2 dots, which generates the list from 0 to 3. Of course, this does the same what the previous example, but it's quite more fun to, obvious to read. Yes, because for my I take from 0 to 3, print it. And because Perl has the concept of implicit topic variable, this $_, it allows you to do that instead of this, because this is just a repetition. You declare and use the variable. And here you just use the implicit topic variable, which is here. But you don't have to be explicit about implicit topic variable. You don't have to use it, yes, because it's implicit. So for 0 to 3, print it, like in normal language. Sometimes, especially in Polish, there are some kinds of words you don't have to speak about, you don't have to talk, and people understand you. For example, I don't have to say I in Polish frequently, because I is inferred from the context, yes? And because this is Perl, of course, and TIMTOWTDI, you can switch from the Perl for statement to for expression and do it as a postfix notation. So these are all the ways to do the same thing. Print it for 0 to 3, yes? And it's actually called an idiomatic Perl. Like in natural languages, there are some idioms which are understood by language users. Because if you can communicate, you can understand it. But from my experience, when we used Perl, we actually explicitly forbade this kind of constructs, because it wasn't as much readable when you have the longer statements or expressions, yes? So we used, for example, only this kinds of constructs. No implicit topics variables and something like that, because when you use it in the first line, it's okay, but if you use it in 10th line, it's not. So it's actually kind of agreement between the two communicators to communicate well, yes? So back to theory, some theory, and actually linguistics theory, there is this concept called linguistic relativity. It was a concept from the 1930s, and it was opposed with universal grammar, which you can probably be aware of, because its main proponent was Noam Chomsky. He proposed the concept of generative grammar, which basically says that there is in brain there is this language acquisition device which allows two people who know the set of rules called grammar and vocabulary, for example words, to communicate without actually hearing or knowing the whole sentence before or ever. And the linguistic relativity is a concept which says basically quite opposite, that the language is actually not in the brain, but it depends on the culture, it depends on the psychology and other things. So linguistic relativity was a concept based on Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. As I said, it was in 1930s, and it was, of course, designed by Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. And those two guys, he was mainly he was a theoretic scientist, and he was actually doing the research, but both of them were actually anthropologists. And he especially is known as a father of modern linguistics because he took the linguistics out of the, the science about language sentence to the psychology field and anthropology and something like that. And those two said that, actually their work was later criticized and and in 1950s, 60s, the universal grammar was main concept in linguistics, but in 1980s, their concept was back. So what actually they said? Edward Sapir said that language is strictly connected to how we are thinking. And thinking is actually creating the language, and it's the both way. So in programming languages, when you write in Java, you think in Java. You think in object orientation and something like that, When you write in Perl, you think about these idioms, or maybe you think how not to use them or use them well. But you can communicate with other users of languages. And Benjamin Worf, he did the research, as I said. He researched Hopi, Native Americans, and he actually discovered that they have very different meaning of time and space, actually, than we have, for example, in Europe or US. So Hopi actually didn't have any words or concepts in language to say about what is going in the month, or for example in a year, or in 2 days. It wasn't very important for them. The hour wasn't important. Actually, it was just basics like, for example, before my son was born, or before the next moon, or something like that. But for example, in English, you have, when you are from Britain, you have this concept of 5 o'clock tea, which is very important to the language users. Maybe we are Polish, so we don't get it, but 5 o'clock tea is quite important. And just think about it when you try to explain the concept of 5 o'clock tea to Hopi people. So it's very, very hard. Actually, it's kind of different thinking, yes? And actually, this morning, my daughter, who is 4, asked me about when is going to be a Friday, because on Friday they can bring some toys to the preschool. And I said, it's 3 days, and later will be Friday. And she said, yes, so it will be tomorrow, and then tomorrow will be tomorrow, and then tomorrow will be tomorrow, and then it will be Friday. Yes? Yes, okay. So she thought like that. And a year ago, she thought about yesterday or tomorrow as anything in the future or anything in the past, So a language determines thinking. As I said, the hypotheses were criticized, but now it's kind of in its renaissance. It's quite popular. So it gave a basics for the cognitive science, which basically expands the whole theory quite much. So back to programming languages and my examples in Perl and Java. The languages are quite old. I mean, there are, Scala, Clojure, and some languages which are from 21st century. And Perl was created in 1987 and Java in 1991. Actually, it was released to the public in 1995. And Perl 5, which is current main version of Perl, was released in 1994. And actually, they have quite different main concepts of language, because Java was created to write once, run everywhere, because C and C++ wasn't fine for Sun back then. And Perl was just created by Larry Wall to get things done quickly, And basically, object orientation, which is very important concept in Java, like, the time in English, was added to Perl later in the language when it was released in 1994, Perl 5, yes? So, in Perl language, you might think there is this mess, many kinds of language constructs to do the same thing. It's not very readable, not very necessary, yes? So Perl community did its lesson and said that there is more than one way to do it, but sometimes consistency is not a bad thing either. Yes, and they it's pronounced TIMTOWTDI bicarbonate, by the way, and they thought about, yeah, maybe we shouldn't propose many new language constructs and just concentrate on some kind of consistency, So, last example from Perl. How do you do object-oriented programming? For example, class. You just declare package foo, which will be later your class, and then declare constructor new, which obligatory name isn't new. It can be named anything. You just shift a class name from the first argument for the argument list, which is implicit here. You just declare some scalar value. It could be hash or array or anything, and then return the blessed reference to the scalar value and with the name. And you must return true value in Perl to actually make it work. So it's not very friendly. Yeah, it's not very friendly. So the Perl community thought, yeah, so maybe we should do some, I don't know, something which is consistent, And they did actually created Moose. It's a framework for object orientation. It's not in a core language, but it's an optional module which then you can use. So it's quite simple and readable. You just declare a package because it's how do you declare a class. You just use this Moose, and it has some attributes. They are read-write, read-only, or something like that. There are some methods, and you have extends and any construct in object-oriented programming you can think of. Yes, but because it's Perl community, Moose was actually created, and it was kind of slow, So there are these Japanese guys who rewrote it in using XS, which is Perl binding to C, and it's actually the same interface. If you can see here, it's the same example as previously. It does have its same API, but it's actually faster. But you have to compile it and have C compiler. So they're kind of different. But as you see, it's consistency what matters. You can choose from the two. But because it's actually a Perl community, they thought, those two are too big. So they wrote Moo, which is another simple object-oriented orientation in Perl, and it's actually quite the same as Moo and Mouse, Moose and Mouse. But it's kind of subset of both of them. It does not have any non-core dependencies. It's pure Perl, and it's quite light. So you can choose. You have small project. You can choose this. You don't have to have any C compiler. But because it's a Perl community, they thought, yeah, maybe you just want to extend something, has some attributes, and then methods, and it's just Mo, yeah. So it's very, very tiny. Actually, it's so tiny, it has everything in one line. It's one line, it's Perl one-liner. So they did Mo and said, if you want, you can use it. Of course, this one-liner is compiled, so don't, when you see the source code on GitHub, it's actually normal, So, but it's kind of consistent with previous examples. But it's a Perl community, isn't it? And of course, that's also M, but M is nothing but using the normal approach to object-oriented programming and blessing the scalar variables and something like that. It's actually a joke. But it shows us that consistency, I mean in Moose, Mouse, and Moo, is very important. And it's actually, TIMTOWTDI is good here because you can choose depending on what you want. Yes? So, Moose and Perl. Which brings me to concept of standardizing things and having those consistency in not only in Perl but in every language, also in Java. Yes, because standards are very important. You must agree on them. You must because people like guidelines and they like to agree or disagree. They have this point of view. Yeah. So, for example, very old example actually. Why should we use tabs or spaces? Should we use them or both? No, both no. So actually, there is some scientific research that tabs or spaces aren't important, but the indentation size is what matters. Actually, it was in Clean Coder, I think, that research, which shows that everything between 2 and 4 spaces is okay. For human eye, it's readable. And everything over the 4, I mean 6 or 8, it's just too much. And everything less than 2, I mean, one space is not very readable, and no spaces, not readable at all. So, and this kind of thing, you must agree with your team and be consistent, because if you aren't consistent, it's bad, Another example is, of course, for holy war of editors, and of course I use Emacs, and it's right choice. And but if you use the same, for example, ID in Java, for example, when you use in your team same ID, it's okay because you have the same preferences. But if you use different IDs, it's okay, TIMTOWTDI, as long as you are consistent in, for example, spaces and tabs. Yeah. So in TIMTOWTDI and this concept of having the choice, the inconsistency is what is bad. Yeah. So it does not really mean that TIMTOWTDI is bad, as you can think from the beginning, that it allows to write messy code. Yes, it allows to make messy code, but it actually is quite nice. So is there any concept or use of TIMTOWTDI in Java? Actually, I think yes, there is. So Java, actually, you can think from the beginning that it has so simple syntax that you actually don't have a choice, or it's stable, so you don't have to experiment with it. It's actually has JVM, so you write and it's bytecode, so you can't optimize it. Actually, it's not important. It has some coding standards, it's best practices, but of course, its syntax is quite verbose. Yeah, more verbose syntax, many places to be different. It actually has this concept of backwards compatibility, which is, hard, yeah, because actually code from JDK110 from 1995 should compile, yeah, basically should compile, and it's difficult for language creators, yeah. And JVM is important in Java ecosystem because it allows to write in different languages, and actually has having one virtual machine to execute the code, yeah. And the coding standards, actually, I've seen teams in Java that didn't agree with Oracle, so they made their own ones. Okay, so that's okay. And best practices, it's kind of subjective, yeah? So take the first point, Java syntax, for example. I said it's verbose, yeah. So simple comparison between Java and Scala. It actually is a value class of person. It doesn't matter if it's string, integer, int, or anything, but what matters is that Java equivalent of this Scala code is quite long. Oh, you can spot the scroll bar? Yeah, you must scroll it down to see everything, because it's hash code, it's equals, it's toString, and everything. It's quite long, yeah? Actually, it was, of course, generated by IDE, but it's kind of pain in the, So how can you fix this? You basically have no choice about the language, Scala, so you have to think about something else in Java, what can help you. For example, there is this utility class of objects. It was present in Guava, and in Java 7 there is it was introduced. So you can actually replace the previous example of hash code and equals, which was very, very ugly, with this much more readable code in Java, in plain Java. It's actually from the Java 7, because in Guava there is equal, not equals. Actually, equal is better because you can't static import equals actually from the objects in JDK. But I think it's better, it's more readable. The downside is that you have to write it, unless you have some generation macro, for example, in your IDE, which can do the same thing as it did in the previous example. So another thing is, for example, toString. You can use more objects. In previous Guava versions, it was actually objects, and toString helper. It's kind of weird using it, but you can. It's actually the equivalent of this. So is it better? I don't know, really. It's generated by the IDE. It could be generated by the IDE, but it's longer, maybe more readable, or maybe not. I don't know. But remember, in your team, consistency is what matters. So either of these is good, I think. Also, you can write the same code, which was in previous slide here in Java, actually using Lombok. But don't use it. It's black magic. You know, the Lombok does very nice thing because you write just this, but it actually it's a hack on a compiler. Actually, it uses non-public API of Java compiler. Actually, I've heard that it can be compiled only on Sun compiler, so it's not a good thing. It does hacks on Eclipse compiler too. So actually, I don't think it's a good choice. But if it's okay to you to have this compiled code and work with this version of JDK and this version of Lombok, it could be possibly okay. So another option for doing this is, for example, Google's AutoValue. It also generates code, just like Lombok, but it uses only public APIs. Hence, it's more verbose and weird, because to create a person here, you have to return. You don't have a constructor. You have only a static factory for this static constructor factory pattern. We call that, and just return some AutoValue underscore person new object with some kind of parameters. It also have downsides. For example, if you change the order of parameters, it could be bad. It's not perfect. But for example, in your team, when you write many value classes, it could be a solution. But it's consistency what matters. Yeah. So another example, another point, it was the backwards compatibility and legacy in Java. So it's also a problem. It allows you to choose from, for example, if you use object array or object, for example, list. Yeah, why should you use object list or object array? So these are points from Stack Overflow and written by Kevin Bullion, and he's a lead developer of Guava. And he basically says that don't use arrays nowadays. It's actually worse for these reasons. I won't read them, but you can check them. And it's actually, I think it's very important to agree on them because, yeah, you might say, if I have this benchmark and it says I don't have, for example, I don't know, memory or CPU or something like that, you of course can use arrays. But basically, there are many reasons you should use lists and some kind of higher abstraction on collection of elements, yeah? So it's very important, and it's also TIMTOWTDI actually, because you can choose from array or list, yeah? And JVM languages, I said that you can't have a choice. Actually, you have a choice because JVM is great. It does what it does because write once, run everywhere. Also, there are many fine languages on JVM: Scala, Clojure, Jython, JRuby, Groovy, whatever. You can write the code. It's compiled to the same code as Java. Nice, very nice. But actually, if you are working in some kind of bigger corporation, employers don't really trust them. And there is big need for Java devs, and for other languages you can have a problem with finding, for example, Clojure dev. So from the business point of view, it's not this TIMTOWTDI part of Java is not that great. But actually you can learn these languages. They're quite nice and quite efficient nowadays. So also I said about something about coding standards. Yeah. It's everything. What matters is this: be consistent, and TIMTOWTDI won't kill you. Choose from some existing conventions, Google's or Sun, Oracle conventions, and or modify them, but write them down. Basically, in my job, we have this document of our conventions. Everybody who is new has to read this and just apply. Use the preferences IDE. That's all. Yeah. Just use the preferences. But, for example, other than code conventions, there are these kind of small examples of, for example, final. The word final in Java, it's kind of tricky because you can argue to use or not to use final. For example, on classes, methods, attributes, variables, and actually, it's the battle for final. if you want to have testing, maybe you won't use final on everything because then you will have to use Power Mockito or something like that. But for example, on the other hand, I tend to use final on my classes which I design, even if they are internal, external, whatever, because it actually does the class effectively immutable basically, and hence easier to, for example, share between threads because you don't have to worry about state because it's immutable. Yeah, it's a matter of choice. So the battle is there, the choice is yours, but again, be consistent. So best practices. Actually, I said about these things. I showed you an example of the big verbose hash code and methods of having them more readable. I told you about the final and minimizing mutability. I told you about that I prefer, for example, prohibiting inheritance and instead have simpler classes and methods. I prefer lists, for example, to arrays, and I use libraries. And does it sound familiar? If it doesn't, you should learn this. If you are a Java programmer and didn't read this book, you should. Yeah. So basically, one other thing I want to tell you about in topic of TIMTOWTDI and Java, it's this, lamdas, the hype word of Java 8, and actually, I want to show you two quotes. First is from James Gosling. He created Java, of course. And in 2006, he said that closures feel to me like the one of these giant black holes. So should we just give into the force of gravity and go with the rest of the world? Actually, he said later it's going to be an entertaining year in 2006, yes. But of course, from the beginning, it was a problem for all the community because some people said that Java already has a closures because it's called animus in their classes, and you just don't solve any real problem adding the construct, the syntactic sugar, to the language because it allows people to choose from. It's hard, It would be like Perl, for example, yeah. But in 2014, Java 8 came out, and finally, nowadays you can read this code. Yes, it's quite of imperative code of searching some albums and tracks and having favorites and sorting them. Yeah, it's quite simple, readable. You can just read this. But instead of this, you can now write this, which is simpler. It can be tricky for you if you haven't used lambdas or functions in any other languages as a first citizen construct. Actually, in Java there aren't first citizen constructs, but anyways, it does read quite declarative, like SQL. If you know SQL, you can just imagine that there are kind of simple language constructs as SQL. So it actually does the same as this. Is it better? Actually, yeah, or maybe not. But there is more than one way to do it. Finally, and lambdas. I would see lambdas in my code if I could have Java 8 in my code base. Should you? It's a matter of agreement and matter of consistency. Yes, that's my opinion about that, about lambdas. So I think it's everything. So do you have any questions? No questions?
Jakieś pytania? Jeżeli nie, to dziękujemy bardzo, panie Grzegorzu.
Thank you.
Gorące brawa.